So, how many of you do know about this raccoon? Okay. How is that possible? My Facebook. There's supposed to be a remote field station, a part of a. Yes, I guess you're not really isolated. Okay, so the raccoon. I love this. So this. Here's the next Dwayne Johnson movie with the scaling the skyscraper with the raccoon on its back. So Bill, thanks so much for mentioning that. In fact, as a little bit of by way of introduction of myself, I had some, let me make sure that I get my clock going so I don't talk too long. I was going to say a few things about why I would have any authority to stand up here and talk to you all on this topic, and I really don't, except for a willingness to try an experiment. And I just wanted to quickly start off from Bill's observations about that raccoon. So taking advantage of that kind of social media sensation is a really useful strategy. So knowing what is going on in the world and then latching on to that. So for example, one of the things that I have the good fortune of being part of is a magazine that we actually publish from the Institute on the Environment. It's called ENCIA, which if you haven't read it, I encourage you to browse it periodically. It's an example of what we call solutions journalism. So it's less headlining and more about deep dives into how people are exploring emerging and, well, sometimes long-term persistent issues in environmental problems. So what did we do? There's this new story on ENCIA out this week on wildlife. So immediately we jump onto social media and start tweeting. You interested in #NPRRaccoon? Check out this article on the importance of wildlife conservation. And we ran that through ENCIA. Another spectacular example of that maybe some of our locals might know. Do you guys watch this program, Stranger Things? Oh, yeah. Of course. I will admit that I have not watched it because it's too scary for my taste, but they had an episode where one of the characters was wearing this old vintage Science Museum of Minnesota sweatshirt that was apparently sold in the 80s. And it was on that show one day, and the next day someone at the Science Museum realized, I gotta make that sweatshirt. And they stocked it immediately and sold thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them and took advantage of that marketing opportunity for the Science Museum of Minnesota. Anyway, linking to what's going on in the popular media is a terrific strategy. So this is my, I put a bio slide in here. So I'm an ecologist, pretend sometimes to be an evolutionary biologist and geneticist. So what am I doing in science communication? I just have a willingness to try. I don't have a degree in journalism. I don't really know often what's going on, but I'm willing to try and experiment. So I threw up here are some of my attempts at science communication, just randomly selected. So it's a kind of biography. So just a couple of days ago, this was a meeting of a bunch of corporate executives in the Twin Cities. There's an economic development organization called Greater MSP. And when they call you and they say, would you be willing to come to talk to our corporate executives about your vision for the future? The answer is yes. Yes, I would be willing to come and do that. So that was an example of this kind of activity. I'll come back to it later, but we all have this idea that if you could get your work covered in the New York Times, then man, you really have arrived because everyone reads the New York Times. Not really. This is a picture of me taken on a trip where we take legislators to Germany to show them the German experience that yes, you can have a healthy economy and renewable energy. And this is the Minnesota's Commissioner of Agriculture, Dave Fredrickson. So this is an example of just through science communication, through relationships with key people. We're going to come back to that. And then this is an example. I'll make this point. It says, thinking about what you are trying to say and to whom are you trying to say it and when do you say it. This was an article we wrote for an online an online editorial on something called The Hill. I don't know if any of you read The Hill, but it's very specifically targeted to The Hill, to members of Congress and to congressional staffers. So we wrote an article about green infrastructure that was specifically timed for when there was conversation on The Hill about the Trump infrastructure plan, which ended up not really being an infrastructure plan. But there was a moment in time where we were talking about infrastructure, and we specifically wanted to target some information about green infrastructure and ecosystem services to The Hill. So we wrote an article to that platform. So there you go. I'm willing to experiment. I've done some stuff. I've tried a variety of strategies, and I've had the good fortune of listening to other smart people. And so, MC again. And so I'm going to share with you 6 kind of random ideas intended to follow on Bill's presentation from a journalistic point of view. I'm going to talk about it from our point of view, where, if I could be so bold as to say our, meaning the academic and government or otherwise practicing scientists. And so I'm going to go through each of these things, and they're also intended, I hope, that when we get into the breakout groups, we start planning what this RCN might want to accomplish around science communication, that these are kind of practical, useful things to keep in mind. So they're not entirely random. They're what I think maybe this setting in this group might find useful for your collective activity. So 6 of them. Some of them are going to have slides, some of them we're just going to talk about. The most important is the first one, and all the others are going to reinforce that point, and that is how important it is to have a plan. And I'll reinforce this later. But you have to ask the question, what are you trying to accomplish with science communication? If you think that science communication is just a collection of items that you write under the media section of your CV, and you count them up and you report them at the end of the year, I wrote 4 op-eds, then you don't have a plan. A plan is something like, what do we want people to know or understand? What action are we asking them to take? Who are we trying to provide this information to? And then imagining if we were wildly successful at achieving this goal that we have, what would that look like? How would people behave differently or act differently or know differently? And then working backwards to say, how would we achieve that wildly successful outcome? When we talk about science communication or we talk about tips for even talking to journalists, we rarely talk about our plan. But even that, when a journalist calls you, one time a person told me a great tip that said, you can say, I'm sorry, I have a student in my office right now. I know you're very important, but could I call you back in 5 minutes? Oh, and by the way, can you quickly remind me what you're calling from, who you're calling from, and what you'd like to talk about? Okay, well, as soon as I get rid of this student, I'll call you right back. And then you sit down and you spend 5 minutes making a plan of what it is that you really want to say, and to whom are you talking, and so on and so forth. But I can't overemphasize that, and that's one thing that I've learned, is not just to go out, start talking, but to really think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Okay, that was my first point. That'll come alive in most of my second point, and in most of my later points too. Related to the idea of making a communications plan that is attentive to what you're seeking to achieve is knowing with whom you are engaging in that plan. So who is it that you're trying to interact with? And always tailoring your communication style and your message to that audience. Why is that so counterintuitive to academics? Because we have 2 styles. Maybe we're learning a 3rd one. But one style is this. You stand up in the front of the room and you tell people. So you're going to go talk to corporates instead of talking to students or to peers. But there are other ways to engage audiences. The other thing we know how to do is to write. So we like to write and tell people our ideas in a written format. And maybe we're getting more savvy with doing things, those talking and writing online. But thinking about who are the recipients. Whenever you go to give a seminar, for example, at another university, the first thing you ask is, who will be in the audience? Is this a general biology department? Do I have to explain to cell biologists what ecosystem services are before I can even get started? Will there be undergraduates in the room? these kinds of questions. These are exactly the same kinds of questions we should be asking whenever we engage in a science communication. And I think more than just gathering information about who the audience is that we're interacting with is to seek some actual knowledge about them. And there are a lot of resources that are available about what those audiences know and what they see. And here are just a few examples. Because if you think about your audience and do a little bit of research about them, you might find some surprising things that will make you more effective and avoid some pitfalls. So many of you have probably seen this 6 Americas thing. So I always pull up, 6 Americas. 6 Americas is a study that was based on some survey research. It's getting a little dated now, but I asked a collection of questions about what people know about climate change and how worried they are about it. And essentially, through a kind of elaborate principal components analysis, if you will, you can identify clusters or groupings of people who have similar concepts or ideas about climate change. And they organize around these sort of 6 rough groupings. And so this study out of the Yale program on climate change communication came up with this concept of 6 Americas. And they gave them names. So some people are just incredibly afraid and they're willing to do anything. And they think the world is about ready to come to an end and we need an incredibly expensive carbon price tomorrow. And other people on the other end, it does not matter what you say. It does not matter what data you show. They do not think it's a problem and they are unlikely to be persuaded that it is, at least with the traditional kinds of methods. But what's interesting about the 6 Americas are the flavors of people in between. And so I often will actually ask, when I'm often talking about climate change, because I work on climate change impacts and climate change adaptation, I will ask a little bit deeper information about the audience, because I'm trying to get a sense of which of the flavors of 6 Americas are going to be there. For some audiences, I've started saying, no, I'm not available on Sunday morning to go talk to the Unitarian, because why? Because in some cases they might just, it's literally preaching to the choir. So for my particular moment in time, they might not be the audience I'm seeking to talk to. At the same time, lots of people might not want to go argue on a combative cable news show, because what's the point in that? You're just talking to the people who are only dismissive. When you think about, oftentimes if you have a general public audience, you can make some assumptions that say, okay, I'm going to have a random slice of this 6 Americas. So some people are going to be nodding their head the entire time I'm talking, and other people are going to be completely disagreeing. But when I'm standing up in front of that audience, I am conscientiously and using tactics to try to engage the different flavors through my presentation. So that's a little bit sort of not just who will be in the room, but a little bit more attentiveness to what are the likely breakdowns and how do they think of the world, and a little digging around in the literature can be helpful. Here's another more recent example. This is a series of studies from part of the EcoAmerica, which repeatedly asks people sort of how they're coming along on climate science. And so now you can begin to shift your thinking about when you're standing in front of the public. You can talk about climate change because many people do think that it is actually happening, and that understanding has been moving in the positive direction the last couple of years. But then you can also get some information about how that varies or is different in different populations. And you can also find out things like, for example, that the vast majority of people think that, that there's some combination of human causes involved. So maybe that's informative to you, that the combination of natural and human causes is where people are, many people, or wholly due to natural causes, where a lot of people are coming from. So you can dig in and find out more about your audience, is my main point there. There's a lot of more and more information available. Another thing about your, so asking this question, am I talking to a certain slice of the public? What does this public think about the issue that I'm talking about? Maybe it's a random slice. If it's a random slice, you can make certain assumptions that there might be a proportion of people who are inclined to what you have to say or disagree with you. But then there are some audiences that are just not a random slice of life, and being aware of when you're stepping into those situations and making adjustments accordingly. So knowing how to handle this isn't for everybody, but this is an important group of people with whom we need to be interacting on biodiversity and conservation issues. We shouldn't be in my opinion, I don't think we should be writing people off. Okay, thirdly, when you are doing science communication as scientists, we have to remember that it is about the people with whom we are communicating or interacting, that it's not about us. And this is probably, Bill kind of alluded to this point already, this is probably one of the hardest things for us. The idea that you would do some background research in order to do a good presentation, that's not novel or counterintuitive to us. But the idea that we're going to enter into a situation and we really don't, our principal concern is not how fancy people think we are or how smart they think we are or how impressive our resume is, that we're actually trying to achieve our outcome. And one of the most important things that I've heard from journalists who interact with scientists that say it's a big hurdle for them is how much we are interested in we imagine this hypothetical reader, for example, or viewer of YouTube or something like this, and we think it's our peers. We think that other scientists are going to watch this, and we're worried what they might think. But it's not about that. Or we think about how this is going to look on our CV, and it shouldn't be about that. And we also know that you shouldn't be expecting traditional rewards from a lot of science engagement. And you know what? That's fine. Because the reward is one of the impact that you built the plan for. I think there's also a lot of power in doing science collaborative communication as part of a team, or as part of an objective, or a program, or a project. Makes you feel like you're doing what is necessary to make that program be successful, and not just, espousing your views on things. But there will be rewards. One of the really important rewards, for example, of spending time with legislators in the state in Germany talking about wind power and electric utility markets, is that those are relationships that you use when you get back home. I call Commissioner Frederickson Dave because I know him, he's a friend. So there are rewards. I think this rhetoric we have that there's nothing in it for scientists to engage in communication isn't quite right. It's maybe just not part of your merit pay increase or something like this. Bill already referenced the power of story. I'll add in there, I think climate scientists have learned a lot about the power of analogy. So importantly, one of the reasons why we tell stories is because we know that our own assumptions about how science communication works is wrong. And this is our assumption. It's called the information deficit model, or usually tends to be our assumption, that we do some science, we produce it in a scientific publication, we call up the journalists and say, hey, you should come write about my science, and then those journalists tell the general public. And there are so many things that are wrong about this. For one, the scientists can interact with the general public if they want to. There's a wider set of media outlets rather than just traditional journalism. You can talk about your work as or before it's being published in creative ways. And then, of course, there is no such thing as, I already covered, of the general public. So knowing that you're not just going to write a scientific paper and then convey that information to people, you need to be creative about how you're going to identify or interact with those members of the public. And that's a couple of useful ways of doing that. One is the power of story. Personally, for me, this has been a very, very hard thing to embrace. So I work on climate science, or climate issues, climate change. I also am an ecologist and tend to work frequently with butterflies. It took me a long time to embrace my inner butterfly. And being willing to put a picture of a butterfly, this is a polar bear, not butterfly. Put a picture of a butterfly up there and just let it sit. And say, isn't this butterfly cool? Let me tell you something about that butterfly. Because I would say, no, it's not about butterflies, it's about big questions. The butterflies are just a useful way of answering a basic question. No, it's not. It's about how beautiful that butterfly is. Why is the polar bear a compelling climate change story? It's partly because they live in cold places and ice is being melted. Is hunting, and they are a particularly vulnerable species and unique in that respect. But really, for many people, it's the fact that they can relate to this organism in a kind of emotional way. And as scientists, we are trained not to feel emotional about our organisms, even though for the vast majority of us, that's actually why we work on them, is because we do like them. So I think some willingness to embrace the human side, if you will, of nature, and the storytelling that comes with, you should care about the plight of this animal. Another useful strategy is always analogy to medicine, analogy to your insurance policy, analogy to everyday life functions, helps people understand and brings lofty ideas down to their level. My picture that's supposed to harken to medicine. Another thing that we know about how to interact with the general public is to be able to relate things to people. I think this is another enormous challenge for us in the biodiversity world. We like to talk about things that are not people. And often we like to talk about people being far away from these things that are not people. The further the better, outside the fence, right? But people care about people. They care about other things too, but they're motivated often by the plight of people. So, and why do they do that? Because they start to see themselves or people that they know or can understand those situations they can relate to in those stories. So this is a picture from the monsoons that hit India and Bangladesh in 2017. And, you know, as a mom, I look at this woman, you see the look on her face, you see this person that she's responsible for, you see the utility of carrying an umbrella in a monsoon when you're walking through waste water. And this says a lot more about climate change in some respects than data that I might show about total seasonal rainfall or how the extremes are increasing in the monsoon. Talk about people. Now, what kind of people do people like? They like their own people, the people that they know. So there's a lot of, these are my people. So again, when I see that picture of the mother and her son, I think about my child. So I do care about people in general, but the closer that we can bring it to my personal experience, or the values that I care about, or my kid, not kids in general. Psychological research tells us that that's what will cause us to be able to relate and to motivate. And that applies everywhere around the world. It's harder to relate to people that you don't know, but everybody has somebody that they're connected to and that they care about, regardless of where you live or what your socioeconomic group is. Next point, I'm almost done, getting close to the end. Say it's the science. It's not just science, it's worldview. And I would say this, many of you probably have heard, you know, Naomi Oreskes and others talking about what is the principal objection that many of those deniers have to climate change. As we continue to tell them more science and more science and more science, and they continue to reject and continue to reject, it's actually not the science they're rejecting, it's the implications behind the science. And so again, know that audience. Study, you know, think about how to interact with people and to think about who they are and where they're coming from. Recognize that it's the worldview that might stand in the way of interpreting your bar chart or your principal components analysis. There's sometimes a lot of what we're talking about people assume involves heavy government intervention. And so I don't want to hear that science because I think it has certain political implications that I disagree with. So some awareness to that. So here, for example, this is one of the ways that I try to implement at least a recognition of worldview, is even that our language, the vocabulary that we tend to use, has a certain kind of orientation about how we see the world and how we see the relationships of people to nature. We talk about facts. These are indisputable, people. If you disagree with me, it's just because you're dumb. We say this is an impact. Things are vulnerable. Or even that we want to conserve things, which has an implication that we're trying to keep it as they were, which might, in some senses, tend to preserve the sort of existing world order. But these are words that people like to hear. These are the things that encourage positive action or resonate with people's identity of how they see themselves or the things that they stand for or believe in, whether they do or not. So what are you talking about that advances prosperity, freedom, stewardship rather than conservation, and in many cases advances equity? Everything in biodiversity science has something to say about these, as well as vulnerability and impact. And so that is a little bit of, I love Bill, he says, you know, we are the doom and gloom. We do, I mean, let's not fool ourselves, we face doom and gloom, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that people will respond much more to positive opportunities and a sense of wellness and well-being and positive contribution than they will a sense of guilt or duty or obligation. And lastly, I'll say think outside the box. And by thinking outside the box, Bill already alluded to this, and we talked about the raccoon. It's not just media coverage, but there are other ways to interact with people. You don't have to go through a press release of your scientific paper. I was going to share this with you. I'm going to skip it this is a trailer of a HBO documentary by James Redford, Robert Redford's son. He's actually in town yesterday afternoon. I had a chance to interact with him about this film. He has a film out about renewable energy. And he kind of takes this, he's not a scientist, he's not a science journalist, he's a filmmaker. But he talks to scientists and gets to know his stuff and thinks about how people want to know and learn about this information, and then goes off and conveys it in creative ways. So if people are interested, we can show that. Okay, here's another think outside the box. We have this model that says if you publish a lot of papers and you are well respected in your field, if you have coverage in the New York Times, then you are the top scientist. That's not true anymore. Some 25-year-old person is kicking your ass and Emily is not 25, I think she's more like 29. But Emily Grassley, I don't know if you know her story. She's now hired as the chief curiosity correspondent at the Field Museum. But her claim to fame in science communication, she has lots of credibility and accolades, rightly so. But she made her space in YouTube, and people came to be interested in what she has to say and like her style and trust her. And so the Field Museum said, "Oh, we need somebody who can help us relate science to this sort of new era." And so they hired Emily to do that. And so she's straight to multimedia and has a strong Twitter presence. And you can do that too. So I'll leave with back to point number one, which was if you want to have all these things, it has meaning, and in this RCN, if we think about what is it that this group is trying to convey about biodiversity science, maybe in these different dimensions about the importance of data collection or data dissemination, or the insights that we gain from monitoring and understanding planetary systems. First, we have to start with what are we trying to do and work backward. Some of these tools that I suggested to do, or things that we need to do and sort of change our thinking and our orientation, helps to make that plan, I think, a reality. But it's pointless if we don't have an immediate outcome. And I think, yeah, that's it.